The evening air in the city had a bite to it, the kind that seeped through layers of clothing and promised a cold night. Outside the grand glass and marble facade of the Crescent City Symphony Hall, the world was divided into two. Inside, it was all warm, golden light, the soft murmur of expensive conversation, and the clink of champagne flutes. Outside, on the wide stone steps leading to the doors, it was shadows and the distant city hum. This was where he sat, as he had for months now. To the people who hurried past, he was just another part of the urban scenery, like a mailbox or a fire hydrant. He wore a heavy navy blue coat that had once been fine, but was now worn thin at the elbows and cuffs. A gray woolen hat was pulled down over his ears. He never asked for anything aloud. A small dented metal cup sat on the step beside him, and he would simply give a quiet nod of thanks to anyone who dropped a coin or a bill into it. The staff of the hall knew him, or knew of him. The security guards called him the Quiet One. The ushers, in a kinder moment, had started calling him Leo because he appeared at dusk, like the lengthening shadows. Leo's spot was strategic. From it, he had a perfect view through the towering lobby windows. His eyes, a pale, calm blue, weren't watching the people. They were fixed, night after night, on the single object that stood gleaming in the center of the opulent room, a grand piano, a magnificent jet-black Steinway. It sat there like a shrine, a beautiful machine waiting for a soul to bring it to life. During galas, a hired pianist would play gentle jazz standards, but to Leo, it was like watching a thoroughbred racehorse being used to pull a cart. The instrument could do so much more. It could weep and thunder and make your heart ache with a single perfectly placed chord. Tonight was a big night. A fundraising gala for the symphony's youth orchestra. The crowd was younger, louder, flush with new money and the confidence that came with it. Limousines disgorged women in sparkling dresses and men in crisp tuxedos, their laughter sharp and bright in the cold air. Leo watched them stream past, a river of silk and perfume. He kept his head down, his hands tucked deep in his pockets. A particular group paused near the bottom of his steps. There were 4 of them, 2 couples, all in their late 20s. They were finishing glasses of champagne they'd brought from inside. One of the men, handsome in a polished, practiced way, had a loud, easy laugh that carried. He was telling a story about a sailing trip, his voice demanding to be the center of attention. His date, a woman with sleek dark hair and a silver dress that caught the light, laughed along, her arm linked tightly in his. The man's name, as his friends called him, was Chad. He was the kind of person who believed the world was an audience for his performance. As his story ended, his eyes scanned the scene and landed on Leo. He nudged his friend. "Brutal night to be camped out here," he said, not lowering his voice. His date, Alyssa, glanced over. A flicker of something pity, or perhaps just discomfort, crossed her face. "Don't stare," she murmured. But Chad was already reaching for his wallet. He pulled out a $20 bill, crisp and green. He stepped up 2 stairs, making a show of it, and dropped the bill into Leo's cup. It was too much money for a simple act of charity. It was a statement. "There you go, old-timer," Chad said, his voice dripping with a false, hearty kindness. "Get yourself a proper hot meal. Steak and potatoes." Leo looked up slowly. His face was weathered, lined with years of hard living, but his eyes were unsettlingly clear and direct. They held no resentment, no shame, just a quiet observation. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper, like pages turning in an old book. "The real music hasn't started yet." The group fell silent for a second, surprised he had spoken. Then Alyssa leaned in, a playful, slightly patronizing smile on her lips. "Oh, you like music?" she asked, as if speaking to a child. Leo's gaze drifted past her. through the glass, and landed once more on the black piano. A deep, almost painful longing flashed in his eyes, so briefly they might have missed it. "I do," he said softly. Chad chuckled, enjoying the diversion. "Yeah? You a fan of the classics? Maybe you know the piece they're playing tonight." He said it like a challenge, not expecting an answer. Leo ignored the question. He was still looking at the piano. He took a slow breath, as if gathering courage from the cold air. "Could I—" he began, then stopped. He tried again, his voice a bit stronger. "Could I play for my supper?" For a heartbeat, there was pure, stunned silence. Then Chad let out a bark of laughter, loud and incredulous. His friends joined in, the sound harsh against the night. "You?" Chad managed, wiping an imaginary tear from his eye. "You want to play on that?" He jerked his thumb toward the $1,000,000 instrument in the lobby. Alyssa's pity had now fully transformed into amusement. This was better than the concert. This was live theater. "He's serious." She giggled. "Sure, maestro." Chad boomed, spreading his arms wide. The performance was now for the whole sidewalk. "Why not? You go on in there and play us something. Give us a little pre-show concert. And you know what?" He pulled out his wallet again, fanning out a fixed stack of $100 bills. "You play something good, and we'll really pay you. We'll fill that cup right up." He meant it as the final, crushing joke. The punchline would be this dirty, homeless man shuffling away, defeated. The crowd of well-dressed patrons flowing into the hall had begun to linger, sensing drama. A security guard inside, a big man named Ray, noticed the commotion and started moving toward the doors. His face concerned. Leo looked from Chad's mocking face to the money in his hand. He looked at the piano. A lifetime seemed to pass in that single glance, a lifetime of music, of joy, of unimaginable loss, and of silence. He didn't look angry. He didn't look humiliated. He simply looked resolved. Slowly, stiffly, he got to his feet. His joints popped audibly. He picked up his dented cup, poured the coins and the $20 bill into his coat pocket, and tucked the empty cup under his arm. "Okay," Leo said, his voice suddenly clear and firm. The laughter died in Chad's throat. He blinked. He'd expected retreat, not acceptance. Elisa's smile faltered. "Wait, you're serious?" she asked. Without another word, Leo started walking up the steps toward the broad glass doors of the symphony hall. He moved with a sudden, straight-backed purpose that hadn't been there a moment before. The small crowd parted for him, their expressions a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. Ray, the security guard, pushed the door open from inside, his brow furrowed. "Hey, pal, you can't just—" he started, but Alyssa, recovered and now thrilling to the spectacle, called out, "It's fine. It's for charity. Our street friend here wants to give us a performance." She waved a dismissive hand at Ray, her tone making it clear that she and her wealthy friends were in charge. Ray hesitated, looking at Leo's determined face and at the eager, sneering crowd behind him. Reluctantly, he stepped aside. Leo walked past him, crossing the threshold from the cold, dark anonymity of the street into the dazzling, warm, and judgmental world of the lobby. The grand piano waited for him, silent and shining under the crystal chandeliers. 100 eyes turned to watch the ragged man approach it. The air was thick with anticipation, a cocktail of second-hand embarrassment and cruel excitement. This, they all thought, was going to be a hilarious disaster. A wave of warm, perfumed air hit him as he stepped inside. For a moment, the sheer brightness of the lobby made him squint. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors and the gold leaf on the walls. The murmur of the crowd was different in here, a low, rich hum of money and expectation. People held delicate glasses, their jewels catching the light as they gestured. They were the background. He was the sudden, stark stain on the perfect painting. He walked towards the piano. His worn boots, scuffed and dusty, made no sound on the thick carpet, then a soft, gritty scrape on the marble around the instrument's platform. Every step felt like a mile. He could feel the weight of their stares on his back, curious, disdainful, amused. The young man in the tuxedo, Chad, and his friends followed close behind, their faces lit with the glee of people who just bought a ticket to the best show in town. Chad had his phone out, already recording, a smirk plastered on his face. A different, older security guard moved from his post by the coat check, his hand going to his radio. But the younger woman, Alyssa, was quicker. She floated ahead, a smile playing on her lips as she addressed the growing ring of onlookers. "A little street performance, everyone. For a good cause," she announced, as if she were presenting a fascinating, slightly dangerous animal. The crowd tittered, shifting to get a better view. They formed a loose half-circle around the piano, a barrier of silk, wool, and skepticism. Leo reached the piano. Up close, it was even more magnificent. The black lacquer was so deep, it looked like a pool of night. He stood before it for a long moment, not touching it, just looking. He ignored the velvet stool. To him, it was a formality, a piece of furniture. The music wasn't in the seat. It was in the keys, in the wires, in the waiting silence of the great wooden body. Slowly, with a deliberate care that seemed almost reverent, he pulled off his old woolen gloves. He stuffed them into his coat pocket. Then he did something that made the first subtle crack in the audience's expectation. He unbuttoned his heavy, warm coat, shrugged it off, and folded it neatly, placing it on the floor beside the piano bench. Underneath, he wore a simple, faded flannel shirt, but it was clean. His arms were leaned out. It was his hands, though, that drew a few quiet glances. They were not the gnarled, dirty hands one might have imagined. They were long-fingered with prominent knuckles. They were clean. There were old, faint scars across the backs, but they were a pianist's hands. They looked both strong and strangely delicate. He didn't sit. He stood at the keyboard, eyes closed. He took a deep, slow breath that lifted his shoulders and then let it out in a long, silent stream. In that breath, the last whispers and giggles from the crowd died away. The silence became thick, heavy with waiting. You could hear the distant clink of a glass from the bar upstairs. He opened his eyes. They were no longer looking at the crowd, or even at the room. They were focused on a point somewhere in the distance, or perhaps deep inside himself. He raised his right hand, his fingers curved not stiffly, but with a natural, relaxed grace. He played a single note. It was a middle G. It wasn't struck. It was placed. The note bloomed in the silent lobby, pure, round, and resonant. It hung in the air, vibrating in the crystal of the chandeliers, seeming to grow warmer as it faded. Before it completely died, his left hand came down, adding a lower note, a B-flat. A simple interval. But the way he connected them, the tiny space he left between, made it sound like a question. A sorrowful, beautiful question. Then his left hand began a slow walking pattern of chords, deep and solemn. They were the footsteps of someone carrying a great weight. His right hand floated above the keys, trembling slightly, then descended into a melody that was like a tear finally falling. It was heartbreakingly simple at first, a fragile, singing line that wrapped around the steady heartbeat of the bass. Someone in the crowd, an older woman with white hair piled high, let out a small, sharp intake of breath. She knew. She might not have placed the piece yet, but she knew this was no joke, that the young man with the phone, Chad, had lowered his arm. The smirk was gone. His face was blank with confusion. This wasn't chopsticks. This wasn't clumsy banging. This was something else. The music began to build. Leo's body, which had been still, started to move with it. A slight sway as he leaned into a passionate phrase, a small dip of his head at a particularly aching chord. His fingers, now a blur of controlled motion, flew across the keys with an accuracy that was terrifying. The piece was revealing itself. It was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most technically demanding and emotionally devastating pieces ever written for the piano. It was a storm contained in wood and wire. The melody returned, but now it was stronger, angrier, intertwined with furious rolling passages in the bass that sounded like thunder. Leo's left hand worked a relentless, powerful rhythm, while his right hand threw off glittering, desperate arpeggios. The music wasn't just in the piano. It was in him. His face, which had been an empty mask, was now alive with feeling. His eyes were squeezed shut again, not in concentration, but in feeling. A deep frown etched his brow during a stormy passage, then his features would soften, almost pleading, during a moment of lyrical tenderness. The crowd was absolutely still. No one coughed. No one whispered. They were prisoners of the sound. The bartender had stopped polishing a glass. The ushers at the doors stood frozen. The older woman with the white hair had tears streaming down her powdered cheeks, unashamed. She was hearing a lifetime of emotion poured out in minutes. Alyssa, who had orchestrated this for a laugh, had her hand clasped over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, shiny with a shock that was turning into something like awe and a dawning, horrible shame. She was watching a soul being unmasked, and she had been the one to demand the mask be ripped off as a joke. Up on the mezzanine level, a door opened. A man in his 60s with a wild mane of gray hair and a sharp, intelligent face stepped out. This was the conductor of the symphony, Maestro Rossi. He was reviewing his notes for the evening's ceremonial speech. The sound that hit him stopped him dead. He knew the ballade. He had conducted orchestras to accompany it. But this was different. This was raw, unchecked, personal. It was less a performance and more a confession. He rushed to the railing and looked down. He saw the crowd, silent and transfixed. He saw the piano, and he saw the man playing it. The ragged clothes, the lean frame, the absolute mastery in the movement of his shoulders and arms. The technique was flawless, world-class, but it was the interpretation that stole the maestro's breath. The man wasn't just playing the notes Chopin wrote. He was living the story Chopin told. Rossi's mind, trained over decades to recognize the subtlest musical signatures, raced. The touch, the way the man made the piano sing without pounding, the way his melodies floated. The rubato, the beautiful aching way he stretched time, holding back and then rushing forward, making the music breathe. He had seen that particular style only once before, years ago, in a competition. A young man from Ukraine, a comet that had blazed across the classical sky and then vanished after a tragedy. Down below, the music was racing towards its famous, furious conclusion. The coda. It is one of the most difficult passages in all of piano literature, a whirlwind of notes requiring impossible speed and power. Leo leaned into the keyboard, his whole body a part of the instrument. The music wasn't pretty anymore. It was a hurricane, a rage, a final desperate cry. The notes tumbled over each other in a chaotic, yet perfectly controlled cascade, and then with a series of crashing, definitive chords that shook the floor, it ended. The final note vibrated into a silence so complete it was louder than the music had been. Leo's hands fell from the keys into his lap. His head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He was utterly spent, as if he had just run a marathon. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, the old woman with the white hair began to clap. It was a single, sharp, clean sound. Then another. Then the man next to her joined. And then, like a dam breaking, the entire lobby erupted. The applause was thunderous, a physical wave of sound. People were cheering, shouting, "Bravo!" Tears were on many faces. They had come for a fancy party and had witnessed a miracle. Leo did not smile. He slowly pushed himself up from where he'd been leaning. He looked at the crowd, seeing them properly for the first time since he'd started. Their adoration seemed to confuse him, even pain him. He gave one small, stiff, almost shy nod. Then he turned, picked up his folded coat from the floor, and started to walk away from the piano, back toward the doors. The crowd, still clapping, parted for him, their expressions now ones of reverence. But before he could reach the cold air outside, a voice rang out, clear and commanding over the applause. "Stop! Please wait." It was Maestro Rossi, rushing down the grand staircase, his eyes fixed on Leo with a mixture of disbelief and certainty. The applause was still ringing in the air, a warm, roaring wave, but to Leo it felt like a distant storm. He moved through the crowd as if in a dream, his legs unsteady. The world was a blur of shiny faces and open mouths. He just wanted the door, the cold, the quiet darkness of his spot on the steps. The music had emptied him out, leaving a familiar, hollow ache. "Stop! Please wait!" The voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. It wasn't the voice of a fan. It was a voice used to command. Heads turned. Leo kept walking, his coat clutched to his chest like a shield. A man in his 60s with a wild mane of gray hair rushed down the last of the grand staircase, nearly tripping in his haste. He ignored the people trying to speak to him, his eyes locked on the back of the ragged coat. He was Maestro Rossi, and for the first time in years, he felt the thrilling, terrifying prick of true discovery. He reached Leo just as a young security guard, wide-eyed and unsure, was beginning to open the heavy glass door for him. "Sir." "Please, one moment," Rossi said, his breathing a little heavy. He didn't grab Leo's arm, but he stepped into his path, forcing him to stop. Up close, the maestro could see the deep lines of exhaustion and hardship on the man's face, but also the striking blue of his eyes. Now clouded with a desire to flee. Leo looked at him, then past him, at the door. "I played," he said, his voice back to that low, rough whisper. "That was the agreement?" "Agreement?" Rossi sputtered, then glanced at the young socialites who had started this. Chad was staring at his phone screen, watching the recording he'd taken with a stunned look. The girl, Alyssa, looked pale, her earlier arrogance completely shattered. Rossi dismissed them with a flick of his thoughts. This was about something far bigger. "That was not an agreement," Rossi said, his voice dropping, becoming more intense. "That was a revelation. Who are you?" "Nobody," Leo said, and made to move around him. "No." Rossi's voice was firm, but not unkind. He lowered it so only Leo could hear. "A nobody does not play the G minor ballade like that. A nobody does not have that touch, that rubato. I have conducted for the greatest pianists of our time. I know a signature when I hear one." He was searching Leo's face, his own mind flipping through a mental catalog of artists, past and present. The way this man had leaned into the keys, the particular angle of his wrist in the runs, the heartbreaking sigh he pulled from the slow melody. It was a ghost, a memory from a faded concert program. You played the secondary theme not with sadness, but with a kind of furious nostalgia, Rossi murmured, almost to himself. You made the piano weep in the recapitulation. I have only ever heard one person phrase it that way. Years ago, at the Chopin competition. Leo's eyes snapped to Rossi's. A flicker of panic, or maybe pain, flashed in them. He took a step back, The name hit Rossi then. It came from the deep archives of his memory. A prodigy from Kew, a young man whose talent was so bright, so fiery, it seemed he would redefine an era. He had won that competition, not just with technique, but with a soul much older than his years. Leonid Volkov. Rossi breathed the name. The effect on the man was immediate and physical. He flinched as if struck. The name, spoken aloud in this glittering place, seemed to land on him with the weight of a tombstone. All the color drained from his face. He looked suddenly old, fragile, as if the single word had broken something inside him that the difficult music had not. Around them, the crowd's chatter had risen again, buzzing with questions. Who is he? What did he say? Volkov? I thought he died. The older patrons, the ones who followed the classical world, were putting it together, their whispers growing more urgent. Volkov is gone, Leo said, the words raw and final. He died a long time ago. The world thought he died, Rossi insisted, his heart pounding. The tragedy was public knowledge, though quickly forgotten by the wider world. A car accident somewhere in Europe, after a concert. His young family? Rossi didn't say it. He could see the whole story etched in the deep grooves around this man's eyes. The man hadn't died in the crash. He had been obliterated by it. I am just Leo, the man said, and this time it sounded like a plea. He was hugging his warm coat to his body. Rossi looked from this shattered figure to the magnificent piano, still seeming to vibrate with the echo of the music that had just torn through the room. The disconnect was impossible. The genius was here, alive, hiding in plain sight on his own doorstep. The injustice of it, the sheer waste, hit the maestro like a physical blow. You cannot be just Leo, Rossi said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, a mix of awe, pity, and a fierce, protective anger. That, he pointed a trembling finger back toward the Steinway. That was not just anything. That was a master. That was a voice the world needs to hear. He saw the fear in Leo's eyes. It wasn't stage fright. It was the deep, animal fear of being seen, of being dragged back into a world that was associated only with unbearable pain. The young man, Chad, had edged closer, his phone now discreetly at his side. He heard the name. His brow was furrowed, and he quickly typed it into his phone. A second later, his eyes went wide with the search results. The old performance videos, the news clips about the vanishing virtuoso, the small articles about the accident. He looked from his screen to the ragged man, and his face crumpled with a shame so profound it looked like sickness. He had mocked a ghost. He had treated a legend like a circus act. Alyssa was crying silently, her perfect makeup starting to streak. She wasn't even looking at Leo anymore. She was staring at her own hands, the hands that had gestured him toward the piano. As a joke, Rossi ignored them all. His focus was only on the man before him. Please, the maestro said, and for the first time, it was he who sounded like he was asking for something. Come upstairs. To my office. Just for a cup of tea. Just to get warm. No cameras. No questions from anyone else. Just talk to me. He could see the war going on inside Leo. The instinct to run, to bury himself back in the anonymous cold, was powerful. It had been his shield for years. But the act of playing, of being recognized, had cracked that shield open. The man was trembling, not from the cold, but from the exposure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Leo gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Rossi let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He turned and gestured to the senior security guard, Ray, who had been watching the whole scene with a veteran's calm. Ray, my office. No one else, please. Ray, understanding the gravity in his boss's tone, nodded. He moved to Leo's side, not to grab him, but to simply be a presence, to help clear a path through the still loquacious crowd. As they turned toward the private elevator, the crowd's energy shifted again. The applause had died, replaced by a frantic, gossiping buzz. Phones were out, videos and photos were being sent. The story was already leaking into the world. Homeless man identified as lost piano genius. But in the slow ascent of the elevator, there was only silence. Leo stared at the closed doors, looking more trapped than honored. In the plush, book-lined office, Rossi closed the door on the world. He pointed to a soft leather armchair. "Sit, please." Leo didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room, looking lost, artifact from a storm washed up in a quiet library. He finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "I did not come back," he said. "The music, it came out. Tonight, it just came out." Rossi poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal decanter, his hands not quite steady. He handed one to Leo. "Why here? Why on my steps for all these months?" Leo took the glass, but didn't drink. He looked at the floor. "The piano," he said simply. "Through the window. I could see it. Sometimes at night, I could almost hear it. It was a connection. To before, a quiet one. I never meant to touch it." He finally looked up at Rossi, and the maestro saw the full, unguarded agony in his eyes. "I have not played for anyone since that night. Not a single note. Until tonight." Rossi sank into the chair behind his desk, the weight of the confession settling on him. The man hadn't just been living on the streets. He had been serving a sentence of silence, living each day next to a temple of music, but never allowing himself to enter. The self-punishment was absolute. "Leonid." Rossi began. "Leo," the man corrected, softly but firmly. "That other man. He lived for the applause. He lived in the light. That light went out. There is nothing left of him but the fingers and the memory. And the memory it is a prison." Rossi understood then. This wasn't about stage fright or lost confidence. This was about a man who believed his art, his very gift, was irrevocably tied to a loss so great that expressing it felt like a betrayal. Playing the piano was remembering. And remembering, for him, was a form of torture. The office was very quiet. Downstairs, the gala was beginning, the orchestra tuning up for their light, celebratory program. It sounded faint and meaningless through the floor. Rossi knew he couldn't offer this man a comeback. He couldn't book him a tour or get him a recording contract. To do so would be an act of violence. So he asked the only question that mattered now. "What do you need, Leo?" The man seemed surprised by the question. He was silent for a long time, looking at his own hands, the hands that had just rebuilt and then destroyed the room downstairs. He slowly flexed the long fingers. "I don't know," he said truthfully. Then, after another moment, he whispered, "But the piano, it is still there, in my head, now that it is awake again." The silence in the maestro's office was thick and heavy. Downstairs, the faint, cheerful sounds of the gala's orchestra floated up a bright waltz, meaningless as tinny music from a distant radio. It belonged to another world. In this quiet, book-lined room, the only real sound was the echo of a name that had been buried for years. Leo stood like a statue, the glass of water untouched in his hand. He was staring at a spot on the Persian rug, but his eyes were seeing something else entirely. The maestro's words had torn open a door he had sealed shut with concrete and pain. Leonid Volkov. Hearing it aloud felt like being stripped naked and thrown into bright sunlight. Maestro Rossi watched him from behind the large wooden desk. He saw the tremor in the man's shoulders, the way his throat worked as he swallowed hard. This wasn't the moment for grand offers or excited plans. This was a wound raw and open, "Sit, please," Rossi said again, his voice gentle. "You look like you might fall over." Slowly, as if his joints ached, Leo lowered himself into the leather armchair. It was soft and deep, the kind of chair that swallows you up. He seemed to shrink into it, becoming smaller. He placed the water glass carefully on a small side table, as if afraid his hands might shake and spill it. "I am sorry," Rossi said. "I did not mean to ambush you with the past." Leo shook his head once, a short, sharp movement. "It is always there. You just gave it a name again." He finally looked at Rossi. "How did you know?" "The rubato," Rossi said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "The way you hold back the time and let it rush forward, it is like a heartbeat catching. And your left hand, in the cascading passages, it doesn't just play the notes, it shapes them. Like a sculptor. I heard you play in Warsaw, 15 years ago. You were a boy, but you played like an old soul. I never forgot it. I argued with a judge that night, said you should have won by a wider margin." A ghost of something, not a smile, but a flicker of distant memory, passed over Leo's face. Then it was gone, replaced by the weary emptiness. "That boy was very proud," he said softly. "He thought the music was his. He did not know it was just borrowed time." The weight of what he meant hung between them. The borrowed time that had run out. Rossi chose his next words with the care of a man diffusing a bomb. "What happened after the accident?" "No one ever really knew. The news said you were recovering. Then nothing." Leo's gaze drifted to the window, to the dark city skyline dotted with lights. His voice, when it came, was flat, a recitation of facts that had scorched his soul. There was a recovery of the body, but not of me. The hospital, then a friend's cottage, then away. The noise of the world, the questions, the pity. It was like acid. The piano was in every room. It was in the silence, too. To touch it was to remember her singing along from the kitchen. To remember our daughter asking for the Dancing Keys song. He closed his eyes. So I stopped. I sold everything. I walked. I kept walking until I was nobody, in a place where no one knew that name. That was the only way the pain became quiet. A dull ache instead of a scream. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Rossi. Here, on your steps, it was a quiet ache. I could see the piano. It was beautiful. It was enough to remember it from a distance. That was the agreement I had with myself. To look, but not touch. "Until tonight," Rossi whispered. "Until tonight," Leo echoed. The young man's mocking face, the thrown money, the laughter, it had sparked a forgotten ember. Not of pride, but of something deeper. A need to prove, just for one moment, that the thing they were mocking was sacred. "I did not play for them. I played for the piano, to apologize to it for my long absence." Rossi felt a lump form in his throat. He understood now. This wasn't a comeback. It was a farewell visit to an old friend, conducted in a storm of emotion. "What will you do now?" Rossi asked. "You can't go back out there. Not tonight. That crowd downstairs, the phones. The story is already everywhere." Leo looked suddenly tired, impossibly tired. Where else is there to go? An idea, which had been forming in Rossi's mind since he heard the first notes of the ballade, finally crystallized. It was not a grand plan. It was a small, quiet one. "You stay here," Rossi said. Leo's head snapped up, confusion in his eyes. "Not in the office," Rossi said with a small wave of his hand. "Here, in the hall, we have practice rooms in the basement. Simple, quiet, private. There is a cot in the first aid room. You can sleep there tonight. For now, just be inside. Be safe." He saw the resistance immediately. Leo was a man who had chosen invisibility. Accepting help, accepting shelter, felt like a chain. "It is not charity," Rossi said firmly, anticipating the refusal. "It is a trade. You have just given my lobby the single greatest performance it has ever witnessed. You have shamed every rich donor in the building into remembering what real art is. You have, in 5 minutes, justified the existence of this entire hall. This is the bare minimum of thanks." He stood up and went to a closet, pulling out a soft, old sweater and a pair of sweatpants that he kept for long rehearsals. "Here, change out of those clothes. They are part of the costume of nobody. Tonight, you are my guest." He then went to his desk, scribbled on a notepad, and ripped off the sheet. It was a simple note. Asterisk Ray. This man has my full permission to be anywhere in the hall, at any time. No restrictions. Asterisk. He handed the note and the clothes to Leo. The practice room at the very end of the basement corridor. It is old. The piano is a little out of tune, but it has a good soul. The door locks from the inside. No one will bother you. Leo looked at the clothes in his hands, then at the note. The simple human kindness in the gesture seemed to disarm him more than any grand offer could. His shoulders, which had been tense rods, slumped slightly. "Why?" he asked, the single word holding a lifetime of suspicion. Rossi smiled, a sad, gentle smile. "Because the music is not borrowed time, Leo. It is a gift, and it is not yours to bury. It belongs to anyone who needs to hear it. Even," he added softly, "if the only person who needs to hear it right now is you." Asterisk. Downstairs, the gala was in full swing, but a strange energy pulsed through it. The performance in the lobby was all anyone could talk about. The video, shaky and starting mid-ballade, was already being passed around. The older patrons spoke in hushed, reverent tones. The younger ones, like Chad and Alyssa, were subdued. Their earlier laughter, now a source of deep shame. Chad had found a quiet corner. He was still staring at his phone, not at the video, but at an old, grainy photo of Leonid Volkov from a decade ago, a young man in a tailcoat, bowing to thunderous applause. The sharp, intelligent eyes were the same. The man on the steps, the man he had thrown money at, was undeniably that person. He felt a sickening wash of guilt. He had tried to buy a hot meal for a ghost, and the ghost had answered with a masterpiece. Alyssa had disappeared into the ladies' room for a long time. When she emerged, her makeup was washed off, her face pale and plain. She didn't rejoin her friends. She stood by a pillar, listening to the orchestra, but hearing only the storm of Chopin that had broken her world open. She had turned a man's private grief into public entertainment, and he had responded by showing her a beauty so profound it hurt. She didn't know how to live with that. Meanwhile, in the stark, fluorescent-lit basement of the hall, Leo found the practice room. It was as described, small, plain, with soundproofing foam on the walls, and an old, sturdy, upright piano in the center. It smelled of dust and aged wood. He changed into the soft sweater and sweatpants. They were clean and warm. He folded his old clothes neatly, the uniform of his exile. Then he sat on the hard piano bench before the upright. He didn't play. He just rested his forehead against the cool wood above the keys. The silence here was different. It wasn't the vast, lonely silence of the streets. It was a waiting silence. The silence of a tool waiting for a hand. He did not play that night. The emotional toll was too great. But for the first time in years, he slept indoors on a clean cot, and his sleep, while not peaceful, was deep. The screams of memory were, for a few hours, held at bay by the simple, solid walls of a room that held a piano. And outside the locked door, Ray the security guard, following his maestro's unusual instructions. made a point of walking the basement corridor on his rounds. He didn't check the door. He just listened. Hearing no sound, he gave a small, satisfied nod and moved on. He was keeping watch, not as a guard, but as a sentry, making sure the music, now that it had finally been awakened, could rest. The next morning, the city moved on. Traffic flowed, people hurried to work, and the news cycle churned. But inside the Crescent City Symphony Hall, a quiet change had taken root. The story of the homeless piano genius had spread, a fleeting viral wonder. But the truth of it was locked in the basement. Leo awoke on the narrow cot in the first aid room. For a long moment, he was disoriented. The smell was all wrong antiseptic and clean linen, not cold stone and exhaust fumes. The silence had a different quality, insulated and still. The weight of the previous night settled on him, not as a nightmare, but as a strange, undeniable fact. He had been seen. He had been known. And he was still inside. He changed back into his own clothes, the worn fabric now feeling like a costume. He folded Maestro Rossi's sweater and pants neatly, placing them on the cot. Then he stood in the doorway of the small practice room, looking at the old upright piano. It sat patiently in a slanted beam of morning light that fought its way through a high, dusty window that he did not play. He simply closed the door, locking it from the inside, and sat in the room with it. That was enough for the first day. Upstairs, Maestro Rossi handled the fallout. He gave a single brief statement to the press who gathered, saying the hall had offered temporary support to a gifted artist in need of privacy, and that further inquiries were an invasion. He was firm, using his stature like a shield. He paid no attention to the online theories or the talk show chatter. His focus was on the fragile peace in his basement. On the second evening, long after the last janitor had left, Leo finally touched the piano. Not to play a piece, but to test its voice. A scale, slow and careful. The notes were a little tinny in the treble, the middle register warm. He played a simple chord progression, something without a name, just feeling the resistance of the keys, the response of the hammers. The sound contained in the small room was private. It asked for nothing. It held no memories of concert halls or lost loved ones. It was just sound. He stopped before any emotion could rise. It was like dipping a toe into cold water, checking the temperature. Rossi, working late in his office, heard the faint, muffled sound of that single scale drifting up through the air vents. He paused, pen in hand, and a slow smile touched his lips. He did not go downstairs. He understood that his role was not to listen, but to make listening safe. A routine began, fragile and unspoken. Leo became the ghost of the hall. The night security team, led by Ray, were given clear instructions. The man in the basement was to be left entirely alone. He was a guest. They would sometimes hear him, not playing full pieces, but practicing passages, a cascading run, repeated over and over. A few bars of a melody, the same deep chord struck with different pressures. It was the sound of someone relearning a language they thought they'd forgotten. Ray started leaving things, not grand gestures. A brown paper bag with a fresh sandwich and an apple placed on a crate outside the practice room door. A new toothbrush and a small tube of paste. A clean towel. There was never a note. Leo would find them, and the empty bag would be in the trash the next morning. After a week, Rossi ventured down. He knocked softly on the practice room door. The sound inside stopped. "It's just me," Rossi called out. After a moment, the door unlocked and opened a crack. Leo looked out, his face less hollow, his eyes a bit clearer. "I am not checking on you," Rossi said, his hands in his pockets. "I am asking a favor. The lobby piano. The Steinway. It needs to be played. Not for show. Just to be kept alive." Instruments get lonely, you know. They stiffen up. Would you visit it? After hours, when the hall is empty and dark. Just you and it. He saw the fear flicker in Leo's eyes. The fear of that grand public space, the memory of the crowd. No one will be here, Rossi said gently. Ray will make sure of it. The lights will be off. Just the emergency lamps. It will be a different instrument in the dark. Leo said nothing, but he gave a slow, single nod. That night, past midnight, Leo pushed open the heavy door to the main hall. The vast lobby was cavernous in the dim, greenish glow of the exit signs. The grand piano was a hulking silhouette in the center of the space, a sleeping beast. His footsteps echoed as he walked to it. He sat, not on the velvet stool, but on the bare floor beside the piano. He leaned his back against its smooth, curved side. He could feel the potential in the wood, a silent vibration of 1,000 past notes. He sat there for nearly an hour, just being near it. Then very slowly he reached up a hand, and without looking, pressed a single key. A low C, the note bloomed in the darkness, rich and profound, and faded into a silence that felt like forgiveness. That asterisk, 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 the young man named Shad, haunted by his own actions, did something unexpected. He couldn't apologize. He felt his words were too cheap, too stained by his earlier mockery. So, with his family's money, he anonymously funded a new city outreach program. It wasn't named after anyone. It simply connected homeless shelters with local music schools and instrument repair shops, offering lessons, therapy, and a place to play for those who had once found solace in music. He never mentioned that night to the organizers. It was his own private penance, a way to try and wash the bitter taste of shame from his mouth. The girl, Alyssa, left the city for a while. She told her friends she needed a break. In truth, she had looked in a mirror that night and didn't like the person she saw smirking back. She went to stay with her grandmother, a quiet woman who played the old hymns on a small organ. Elisa would sit and listen, saying nothing, finally learning the difference between noise and music. Leo's life settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. He was no longer on the streets, but he was not of the world either. He was of the hall. During the day, he would read books from Rosie's office, or help the elderly head usher polish the brass railings, simple, mindful work. The usher, a former clarinetist, never asked questions. They worked in comfortable silence, but at night, the hall became his. He would play, not the furious emotional torrent of that first night, but exploratory, gentle things. He revisited old pieces, deconstructing them, playing them wrong to hear them right. He composed fragments of melodies that went nowhere, just patterns of sound that matched his mood. Sometimes it was joyful. Sometimes it was a dirge. The night security guards grew used to the soundtrack of his recovery. They'd do their rounds to the sound of a Beethoven sonata echoing faintly down a corridor, or the lonely searching notes of a blues scale. One evening, Rossi came down and stood outside the basement practice room, listening. Leo was working through a difficult section of a Rachmaninoff concerto, stopping, repeating, cursing softly under his breath in Ukrainian, then trying again. Rossi smiled. That was the sound he'd been waiting for. Not perfection, but the struggle for it. The engaged frustration of an artist at work. He knocked and entered. "It's getting better," he said. Leo shrugged. "The piano is stubborn. So am I. I have a proposal," Rossi said. "Not a concert. Never a concert, unless you one day ask. But the children. The youth orchestra. They are talented, but they have only heard music from speakers and screens. They have never been in the same room with what you have. Would you let them sit here, in this room, while you practice? Just so they can hear what it really sounds like. So they can feel the air move? Leo was silent for a long time. The idea of an audience, even a small one, sent a chill through him. But the word children softened the edge of his fear. They were not critics. They were just ears. No talking, Leo said finally. No looking at me. They look at the floor. They just listen. That is the rule, Rossi agreed, Dot. And so, once a week, 3 or 4 teenagers from the youth orchestra would be brought down, wide-eyed and hushed. They would sit on the floor against the soundproofed wall, and Leo would play. Not a performance, just his practice. He would ignore them completely, but he played differently on those days. With more care, more clarity. The children would sit utterly still, their heads bowed as instructed, feeling the vibration of the chords in their chests, hearing the click of the keys, the soft sigh of the sustained pedal. They were not watching a show. They were witnessing a craftsman in his workshop. It was the most profound music lesson they would ever have. Months drifted by. Leo's hair was trimmed. His old coat was replaced with a simple, sturdy jacket from the lost and found. He had a room in a modest boarding house paid for by small, anonymous maintenance work, fees from the hall. He was not Leonid Volkov, the vanished genius. And he was not Leo, the man on the steps. He was something in between. A man who had made peace with his ghost. The music was no longer a prison of memory, but a companion in the present. It was a conversation he had with the night, with the old piano in the basement, and sometimes with the grand beast in the dark lobby. The city forgot its viral sensation. But if you walk past the symphony hall very late on a quiet night, when the streets are empty and the world is asleep, you might hear it. Faint, behind the great walls, the sound of a piano. Not playing for fame or money or even for an audience. Just playing because, after a long, long silence, it feels like breathing again. And that, for now, is enough.